Good afternoon. I do get asked to speak at a lot of events, but I almost never accept the invitation. It's put in the diary, usually months ahead. I have to prepare, and it's like a dark cloud hanging over me. On this occasion, I thought that having 3 grandchildren at the school made it sort of obligatory to turn up to avoid them getting expelled. And then I got the letter, just for a bit of guidance. Perhaps you could comment on the economic issues of the day. Previous speakers having covered such topics as the future of global economy, the post-Brexit world, fragmentation and protectionism. And then in the blurb that went out, which I'm sure you've all read, it reminded everyone of a previous year's speaker, which covered the connection between the EU debate, Brexit, Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, renewed nationalism, fragmentation, protectionism, and the rise of China as a world power. Really? Bloody hell, you've got the wrong guy. I'm a shopkeeper, and my single O-level in woodwork doesn't qualify me to discuss anything I don't understand, and to be honest, I don't know what fragmentation is. And I bet 90% of you don't know that either. So instead, I just thought I'd tell you the Iceland story. Because maybe it might inspire the younger members of the audience to think about business as a career, as opposed to the usual ambitions of high achievers, the professions. But first, I will comment very simply on one aspect of the political and economic issues of the day. Years ago, if you were in business, or in trade, as it was often called, you were without doubt a notch down on the social ladder, looked down on even. But in life, there are mainly 2 kinds of people, spectators and players. The spectators are the commentators, shouting advice from the sidelines, much like the crowd at a football match. The players are the ones who have to do the work and score the goals. Spectators can be politicians, journalists, bankers, even accountants and lawyers, all giving their views, but probably incapable of running a chip shop themselves. The players are the people in trade, the ones who get their hands dirty and create wealth. A wonderful guy called John Garnett from an organisation called the Industrial Society told me a story of a visit he made to a factory. And he asked one of the workers what his job was. The worker, in his overall, said, "I cure cancer." John was shocked and asked him what he meant. And he said, "I help run this factory to make a profit and pay the tax that pays the doctors to cure cancer." Jeremy Corbyn wants to give everything to everybody. And by the way, I've just read Tom Bower's book about Corbyn, Dangerous Hero. You've got to read it, because then you'll be ready to leave the country if ever it gets into power. We all know that we need more police, more schools, more hospitals, more social services, more of everything. But where does the money come from? There's only one place: business. We pay the taxes to fund everything. Sure, civil servants also pay tax, but only out of the wages which are paid by the tax I pay from the profits I make. And I suppose my point here is that business is much maligned. Sure, we've got Philip Green and the like, but the main businessmen are the heroes who pay for everything. So if you're in business, be proud of it. I'm proud to be a shopkeeper. And here's my credentials. I now employ 25,000 people. In the last 13 years, Iceland has paid 1.4 billion in UK taxes. That's enough to pay for thousands of doctors, built schools, or even pay the wages of hundreds of diversity officers, or give foreign aid to China and North Korea, which we do. Last year, Britain gave 47 million of aid to China. But then these decisions are made by the spectators. Iceland has also given 24 million to charity in the last 10 years, including 15 million to dementia research. We try to give money to charities where we can really make a difference, and dementia research is massively underfunded compared with cancer or heart disease. Even though it's now the country's biggest killer, with 1 million people living with it in the UK today, it was costing the economy 26 billion a year in 2014, and that number will be much higher now. When the government introduced the 5p levy on carrier bags in England in 2015, I worked out that if all the British food retailers, excluding the Germans, clubbed together for just 1 year, we would raise £100 million, which just happened to be exactly the same amount as the funding shortfall for a much-needed UK dementia research centre. I worked really hard to make that happen, but came up against the usual barriers of not invented here, prior commitments and worker democracy. Nevertheless, I did persuade 9 other retailers to put in some money, and together we raised 20 million, of which Iceland gave half. As it turned out, that was just enough to kickstart other funding from the government and charities that made it possible to create a new London hub for the UK Dementia Research Institute. And this will bring all the top scientists in the field together, and so bring us closer to the day when there's an effective treatment or cure for this devastating condition. And I think that's a really good example of business achieving something positive for society. Twice in 3 years, our own staff have voted us the best big company to work for in Britain. You might have seen the survey in the Sunday Times last month. This year we were number 8, and it's the 13th consecutive year that we've featured in the top 10. Interestingly, for the last 7 years in a row, we've been ranked number 1 for giving our staff a fair deal. They are happy with their rate of pay, even though we can't afford to be a massive payer. And 2 years ago, we beat the mega bonused investment bankers at Goldman Sachs into second place. Which just shows there's more to your job than the amount in your pay packet. And obviously, we want our staff to be happy because we're nice, caring people. But it also makes hard commercial sense, because happy staff make happy customers, and happy customers put cash in the till. So, the Iceland story. How did it all start? Well, it was 49 years ago on the Horseshoe Pass. I was working for Woolworths at the time, and I suppose I should explain, for the benefit of younger members of the audience, that Woolworths was a linchpin of the British High Street that went bust 10 years ago. When I jumped from school as a management trainee, it was one of the most famous, successful, and importantly to me, the highest paying retailer in the UK. And can you believe, at that time when I joined, it was the 6th largest company in Britain. Anyway, that was when I joined. After 7 years, I'd reached the dizzy heights of deputy manager at the Wrexham store, and I hated my job and I wasn't very good at it. And one Saturday night, I was going out for a drink with a Woolies colleague called Peter Hinchcliffe. And as we were driving through Farndon, we saw a strawberry seller at the side of the road who was just packing up. And on some impulse, we stopped and bought his remaining stock. And the next day, a Sunday, because shops closed on Sundays in those days, we pitched up on the Horseshoe Pass and set up stall. And no car stopped until we learned our first lesson in marketing: sex sells. Peter and I hid behind the wall. His girlfriend and my wife sold out pretty quickly. We spent the money an hour later in the pub, and that prompted the question, what shall we do next? And next was to open a shop in Oswestry selling loose frozen foods. November the 18th, 1970. 2 freezers, a scale, a cash register were bought on hire purchase, a lick of paint in the shop were paid for out of loose change, and then £30 each for the first month's rent to board the breweries in Wrexham was the first month's rent, was the only money we ever put into the business. We called it Iceland because my wife Rhiannon thought of the name. It's hard to picture now, but in 1970 most people didn't own a fridge, let alone a freezer. So they bought loose frozen food just as much as they needed to cook for that night's tea. And we sold it by weight. And of course, they saved money compared with buying a branded packet from Birdseye. We bought our frozen food on credit from Nigel Woodward, who's in the audience today. And we were in business. Woolies found out what we were doing, and we were fired 2 months later in January. But we were free. And for the first time in years, we could enjoy our job or enjoy being self-employed. A second shop followed at Easter in Rill, a third in Flint, and then Mould, all in the first year. And it was easy. We discovered something called positive cash flow. Because we spent next to nothing on the shops, we had 4 weeks credit from Nigel. We'd got money in the bank before we had to pay him for the stock, except for paying for wages. Hence cash piled up, and Nigel was funding our business, so thank you, Nigel. With 4 frozen food shops, we decided not to put all our eggs in one basket. So we opened a chicken and chips takeaway in Oswestry. It was a disaster. No sales at all during the week, and then a never-ending queue of drunks on a Friday and Saturday night, which made us a fortune. The trouble was, though, I was usually driving home at the crack of dawn on Sunday morning, and it was just unsustainable. So it was a relief when the fire officer said he was going to close us down for breaching fire regulations. But then I had a stroke of inspiration, and I approached a competitor in Oswestry, saying, this town isn't big enough for the 2 of us, so give me £1,000 and we'll close down. So he did. The money was paid over in cash in Littlewood's Cafe with all the notes smelling of salt and vinegar. My half, £500, helped me furnish my first house. And I'd like to say then that we concentrated on Iceland, but we could never resist trying other things. Call it the entrepreneurial instinct, but in those early years our experiments included a pizza restaurant in Rill, a shop selling seconds from Marks and Spencer's in Oswestry, a printing business, an electrical retailer, and later we went on to large-scale farming in Hungary and lost money in all of them. Even now, I'm involved with a distillery in Iceland that makes vodka and gin. Iceland, the country, that is. But I'm chairman of a restaurant business that includes Piccolino, Opera Grill, Gino de Campo, and at least that has been very successful, unlike our previous efforts. But despite those distractions, Iceland soon had a chain of 20 loose frozen food shops. And Nigel's dad and uncle, Bill and Norman, joined us for a few years as investors, and we just grew and grew. We were running the business from a tiny cold room in Rill, and our office was in a terraced house nearby. And after an enormous struggle, we raised £300,000 from the bank, which funded the building of a new Colt store in Deeside. And we moved our offices into a porter cabin next door, where we've been ever since. That is in Deeside, not in the porter cabin. Our shops got larger and larger, and we started selling more and more packeted products. And then one day we stopped selling loose frozen food and became something called a freezer centre. The boom at the time was for people to buy large chest freezers and keep them in the garage. And we were selling them bulk packs on which they could save money. And there were dozens of other freezer centres, companies around at the time, but one by one they all went bust. And we took over quite a few of them, until there were only 2 of us left. Iceland and a rival based down south, more than twice our size, called BGM. In 1984, we decided to float our business on the stock market. I don't know why we did, it just seemed to be the natural progression of things, but I bitterly regret it now and wish we hadn't. I was 38 years old at the time and still nervous about how long we could keep the business going, so the prospect of taking out some cash was appealing. That was a learning experience, my first brush with the city and merchant bankers. I was naive and had no idea. So when we were oversubscribed on the share issue 113 times, an all-time British record, I was delighted. Until it dawned on me a couple of days later we'd been underpriced and sold on the cheap. My stake in the business in 1984 was worth 10 million, and I took out some cash, and I thought I was set for life. But I soon spent it, and then spent the next 16 years watching our share price, which is not a rewarding experience. But I suppose one thing that you do get out of being a public company it allowed us to issue more shares to take over BJAM in 1988. And that was an exciting, hostile takeover bid. And we won a long battle by getting 50.09% of their shares, about as close as it's possible to be. We had 183 shops, BJAM had 267, and it made us a serious national player. And soon after, we got Princess Anne to open a 500th shop. And I never really thought about it at the time, but I don't think it's something royals do, open shops. Anyway, sales and profits just grew and grew. And between 1970, when we started, and 2000, we increased our profits every single year for 30 years in a row. And that has got to be some kind of British record. Actually, we didn't quite. In 1996, we had one tiny little profit reduction, but the world ended. Our share price crashed. And the reason being, the city had never really been able to work out why we existed. A small shop on the high street without a car park selling frozen food. Well, we reorganised, innovated, and we introduced something called home delivery, which put 13% on our sales overnight. Our sales and profits recovered, but our share price never did. And I remember at an analyst meeting, when we announced this, analysts are the spectators who advise fund managers, talking about the introduction of home delivery. And they were wildly excited for about 10 minutes, as they thought we were talking about internet shopping or telephone ordering. They could understand that with their own affluent lifestyles, cash rich, time poor. But when we explained, no, the customer's got to go into the shop, do the shopping, pay for it at the checkout, and then we drive it home for free, they just couldn't get their minds around it. What's the point of that? Well, in the real world of Wigan and Wrexham, people go shopping on the bus. It's a godsend. And within 1 year, we were doing over 100,000 deliveries every week. Anyway, that brings us to the year 2001, when I got fired for the second time in my life, but this time from my own company. Almost 30 years to the day since I was fired by Woolies. I'd just bought Booker Cash and Carry, and that took our annual sales to 5 billion. Interesting, Tesco bought Booker last year for almost 10 times the price that I paid. One of the reasons was that I was wanting to retire, and it got me Stuart Rose as my replacement. He was the boss of Booker. He is now Lord Rose, more lately of Marks and Spencer's, and the famously unsuccessful Britain Stronger in Europe Remain campaign. And the fact that they thought the BSE was a winning acronym probably says everything. Anyway, this is a long and complicated story, but basically he stitched me up by pretending that he wanted the job of running the combined business, and then he did a runner after 6 months, leaving me with it. But I replaced him pretty quickly with a guy called Bill Grimsey, who with ultimate treachery put out a fictitious profit warning when I was on holiday a few weeks later. The share price crashed. I was leaving anyway, but was booted out early, and then I was investigated by the Serious Fraud Office for a share sale I'd made earlier. Any new chief executive coming into a business will want to clear the decks, tuck money away, and make provisions for things that might happen. It's in their interest to lower the first year's profits, blame the previous management, and make themselves look good with a lower target going forward. But there are limits. The end result of this is that for the next 4 years, Iceland declined every year. And this new retail genius, who was very good at manipulating the press, took it to the point of bankruptcy. Sales had declined 25% in 4 years, but the number of people at head office had gone from 800 to 1,400. And you don't have to be very clever to work out that wasn't a good idea. He was losing money every single year in spite of the fact that he'd made provisions of £90 million from his profit warning, which were quietly fed back into profits as not needed. But he still managed to make losses. And it's all explained on our website under About Iceland, and he's not sued me yet. I was so full of anger that instead of retiring, I started a new frozen food business called Cool Trader. And in 4 years, I opened 30 shops. And that was also how long it took to be finally cleared of any wrongdoing by the fraud office with a letter that came by second-class post. Anyway, a company called Bauga, based in Iceland, the country of all places, bought the entire group, which consisted of Iceland, Booker, properties and a food service business for an absolute knockdown price, putting Grimsby out of his misery. And I was part of the consortium that bought out the Iceland food element of the business for only 125 million, which was a fraction of the price that the company was valued at before Mr. Grimsby appeared. The money was put in as a loan by the bank, which we paid back 1 year later, so we were in for free. I went back into the business on 11th of February, my birthday, in 2005, and I wasn't sure the company could be saved, but I wanted to get my hands on the books and see what Grimsby had been up to. I had KPMG Forensic and Kroll carry out an investigation into the accounts, and it was damning. I sent it to the authorities, but of course, nothing happened. Every single part of the business had been so comprehensively screwed up that sorting it out turned out to be so much easier than I had ever imagined. And over the next 7 years, we took our profits from less than zero to 230 million. During that time, Bauga went bankrupt. They had the majority stake, so their shares were taken over by an Icelandic bank. A year later, the bank went bankrupt. So their shareholding was frozen until a new owner could be found. We had an agreement with Bauga, which the banks inherited, that if the business was ever sold, we could buy it, provided we matched their top offer. Asda and Morrison's made offers to take us over, and so did several private equity houses. Our philosophy was quite simple. I would never again want to run a public company. The average tenure of a public company CEO is 4 years. That is unbelievable. Everything is short term. Aldi is a privately owned by a German family, one of the richest in the world. They've got stores all over the world. They've been in England for 25 years and they lost money for the first 20. They play the long game. Can you imagine Tesco doing that? The shareholders would revolt after a couple of years. Private equity is even worse. They buy a company, rack it up with debt, squeeze the profits and sell it on 4 years later. We wanted investors who would take a long view, basically to never sell. That way we can ride out a lean year and invest for the long term, do the right thing. So in 2012, at the peak of our profitability, I bought the business from the banks for £1.5 billion. A business that started with £30 and bought just 7 years earlier for 125 million. We secured investments for the purchase from 3 private individuals. 2 of them, at our suggestion, sold then to the third investor, a South African called Christo Visa. We're in this for life. My son is now in the business. We have a great relationship with Christo, which is just as well as immediately after the purchase, the retail landscape changed beyond recognition and our profits dropped from 230 to 150 million, where they've held more or less steady ever since. When I say the retail landscape changed beyond recognition, there's many reasons for that. Aldi and Lidl taking market share, price deflation, shopping habits, the rise of online shopping, 2,000 convenience stores opening in just 2 years, B&M bargains, home bargains all started selling food, which they didn't before. Everybody eating away at our market. It's a new world now, and it won't go back to how it was. Tesco and Sainsbury used to make a 5.5% profit on the sales, which is one of the highest levels in the world for a supermarket. Tesco's target is now 3.5%. That's their target. We used to make 8.5%, which is ridiculous. We're now looking at 4%. Consider what's happening on the high street. Bankruptcies, CBEs, store closures, staff redundancies, Tesco cutting 9,000 jobs, Marks and Spencer closing 100 stores, household names that have been around for years have disappeared, but we're still here and expanding. This next year we'll open 90 new shops and 2 new distribution centres. We'll spend 100 million on our expansion plans. So how come we're still here and it seems the rest of the high street is closing down? It sometimes feels like we're the last man standing. Well, we've been around for 49 years because we've been able to evolve. Gareth, my son-in-law, sent me a cartoon a couple of years ago. I had it blown up and it's now on our boardroom wall. And every time we have a managers' conference, I show it as a slide. It's a cartoon of a group of people sitting around a boardroom table. And the chairman is saying, instead of risking anything new, let's play it safe and continue our slow decline into obsolescence. 25 years ago, I invited an American guy to come and speak to our senior management. His name was Maurice Sheckman. I can't remember what he talked about except for one sentence that stuck with me ever since. And he said, if you guys still want to be in business in 5 years' time, you better be in a different business. Did you know Kodak? Well, you do know they invented film and had the world market. But surprisingly, they also invented the digital camera. But they didn't change the strategy to go with it. They carried on selling film, play it safe, so they went bust. Nokia started life as a timber company 150 years ago. Then they made shoes, then radios, then mobile phones. And they managed to evolve and survive. They had the world market in mobile phones, but they didn't see the smartphone coming, so they went bust. Basically, it's evolve, adapt or die. And the pace of change is now faster than ever before. Iceland started out with tiny shops selling loose frozen foods. Then we expanded into bigger shops and started selling packeted products. Then we became a freezer centre. Then we started selling ready meals, grocery products and chilled products. We became a convenience store, not a convenience shop selling newspapers, cigarettes and open long hours, but a convenient place to shop on the high street. And I know people only think of us as a frozen food retailer, and that's what we're good at. We sell more frozen food than anybody else in the UK except Tesco, but you might be surprised to know our biggest selling product is milk, followed by bread, followed by eggs. In fact, there's only one frozen food product in our top 10 best sellers. Then we started home delivery, which eventually led to online shopping. Our online shopping business is now massive and growing at 25% a year. We do more deliveries every week than Ocado. 4 years ago, we started a new concept called the Food Warehouse. It's a sort of a cross between Iceland and Costco. Large shops, 4 times bigger than Iceland on retail parks. We have almost 100 of them now, and we're set to open at least 30 more every year. Sales are growing. Our problem is the old Iceland stores, and it's hard to work out how to keep their sales even flat. So I think we've survived and prospered against all odds because we've constantly changed, adapted, innovated. And we also try and keep ahead with our initiatives, banning artificial colourings, flavourings and non-essential preservatives before anyone else in the 1980s. Banning genetically modified foods before anyone else in the 1990s. More recently, leading the way in pledging to get rid of plastic packaging from our own label range by 2023. And we stopped using palm oil in our own products. You don't need an original idea to be a successful entrepreneur. In 1970, I pinched the loose frozen food idea from Lewis's department store in Leeds. But you do need to execute the idea a bit better than the person you pinched it from. And you also need to keep in touch with your market and be prepared to evolve and give your customers what they want. Ideally, think ahead and give them something they didn't even know they wanted until you offered it to them. Because as somebody famously observed, if Henry Ford had convened a focus group before he launched his first car, they'd have told him that what they really wanted was a better horse. The list of famous retail names that have gone bust or being brought back from the dead grows longer by the day. Woolworths, C&A, BHS, Comic, QuickSave, Toys R Us, and I could go on and on and on. Tens of thousands of jobs lost, billions lost to the economy. And the spectators can tell us with hindsight where each one went wrong. Excessive business rates and successful tax avoidance by online competitors certainly haven't helped, but ultimately the biggest single common factor in business failures is complacency. the failure to keep pace with changing consumer needs, and the belief that your own business is too big and too special to fail. So if I can close by offering some simple bits of advice as a business person to a business lunch, and it's these. Be a player, not a spectator. You'll probably make more money and have more fun, and you will certainly make a more important contribution to society. Be prepared to challenge your own preconceptions and step outside of your comfort zone and change what you do. It don't matter how hard it seems. And talking about stepping out of your comfort zone, what about Brexit? The fundamental problem we faced is that the people were asked to make a choice, and the political establishment didn't like the answer, precisely because they considered it very hard to deliver. After 40 years of allowing the ratchet of ever closer union to operate, binding us to the EU way of doing things. But nothing should ever be too hard if the will is there to achieve it. The key difficulty since July 2016, in my view, has not been the scale of the challenge, but the lack of will to deliver a solution by MPs and civil servants who've always leaned heavily to remain. Looking at the choice of parties led by Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, many of us feel that we're in serious need of some better politicians. The politicians, meanwhile, clearly feel that they need some better people. The money is on the people to come out on top. My money is on the people to come out on top, and for Brexit to work out. Though I have no doubt that it will be trotted out as an excuse for a whole host of completely unrelated business failures over the next few years. Next year, despite Brexit, I'm planning a celebration because it will be 50 years since Iceland started, and I'm still here. True, I was only a boy when it started, but I'm still here because we've constantly changed and evolved. And there's no alternative to evolution, apart from death. And that really is a lousy alternative to absolutely everything, including getting older. So enjoy life to the full while you can, and thank you for listening.